Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It is June 7th, 2020, 10:24 a.m., and we are following a storm that I think everyone knows about at this point, Tropical Storm Cristobal, however you want to pronounce it. We all know we're on letter C, the third named storm of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Believe it or not, this is the most storms we've had by this time in June ever, actually. We've had some in April. We've talked about these in the past seasons, but to have three named storms by June 7th is some sort of record. I will look into more of that as we continue to follow these storms. The deal with Cristobal, very interesting storm. It's almost like a giant nor'easter in the Gulf of Mexico. It's definitely a tropical storm as it has 50-mile-an-hour sustained winds. It is just pretty messy. A lot of the hard weather we're getting is in the west coast of Florida. In fact, we had a major tornado last night that almost took out protesters. This was in downtown Orlando. You could see this from the bank of a lake looking in towards the tornado. You got some lightning strikes in there. Things spinning fairly fast. I turned the audio off because I didn't want to deal with copyright issues, but along with this, we have a snapshot of the tornado itself. So a tornado spun through downtown Orlando, Florida on June 6th after it was spawned by the outer edges of Tropical Storm Cristobal. Now, as far as these tornadoes go, when we have storms like this in the Gulf, guys, that spin counterclockwise because we're in the northern hemisphere, the stronger part of the storms are usually to the northeast of the storm. The northeast quadrant's right up here. This would be the southeast quadrant, and so on and so forth with the west side. When we factor all this stuff in, we can kind of see how the counterclockwise spin is the reason that these tornadoes, sometimes hundreds of miles away from the center part of the storm, tropical storm, hurricane, whatever it may be, we see why these tornadoes spawn. And we can kind of track this back to last night or the early evening of yesterday when this tornado actually popped up in Orlando. You can kind of see these high clouds billowing out of the flatter clouds is what it looks like, but you can see this is all part of Tropical Storm Cristobal. And now the center part of the storm last night was right here in the dead center of the Gulf. As we move forward, you can see these lines of strong storms popping out from the east side of the storm. That is usually the strongest part, as we said. This is why the storm surge that we're worried about for Louisiana and Mississippi is in this little pocket right here, the southern part of both of these states, actually. But when we look at Orlando, you can kind of see where these storms produced right across here, right across the center part of Florida, a little bit higher than center, but you can kind of see how they're exploding out of the top of the clouds. You can see that right there, and that is a direct result of the strength of this storm, which is obviously a tropical storm, not a Category 1. We had some worry about it being a Category 1 storm, but that did not happen. So when we see the spin of the storm as we go through overnight, we can't see much with the infrared. And then we get into this morning, we could still see how the center of the storm is now much closer to Louisiana. A little bit of a shift to the east, but this thing is going to come up and make a little bit of a dart to the west and then up to the east as it gets pulled across by the jet stream. But again, as we watch closely, you could see how the counterclockwise spin is pushing stronger storms out into this area. We could see the panhandle of Florida getting a pretty decent-sized storm. In fact, if we pause this near that area, I want to show you guys something. You could see this entire side of the storm is getting a lot of heavy storms outside of it in the state of Florida, a lot of them in Mississippi, Alabama, and even Georgia at this point. If I bring up radar scope, we could see how we have severe storm warnings near Tallahassee, Jacksonville, and we could see the brunt of Cristobal now actually making its way. Landfall, if we're going to call it a landfall, is going to be just in this area as we showed in the other chart. But we can see these orange areas are special marine warnings. This is where they put warnings for storm surge, which is about 3 to 5 feet, if I'm not mistaken. This chart here will help us understand that. As you can see, Morgan City in the southern part of Louisiana, and then we go all the way up into Mississippi where Ocean Springs is. You can see the highest storm surge rate is right in this pocket here. And again, that is directly a result of the counterclockwise spin of the storm, which pulls water away. It might actually pull water out of Morgan City and then push it into Ocean Springs, which is why the highest reading of 3 to 5 is in that area. And then the outskirts on the east side of the storm, 1 to 3 feet as we get into the panhandle of Florida. And then Tampa Bay all the way down to Marco Island. That's almost southern Florida. So you can see how this storm is covering a wide range of the Gulf. All right, we're going to check out Tropical Tidbits now to see what Cristobal is going to do and what we can expect a little ways after this. Now, again, we can see pressures down to 996. I believe on the other website it's at 994. A little bit of a discrepancy between the barometric pressure, but that is not really the issue right now. The issue is going to be that storm surge and the east side of this storm, which is clearly affecting Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and then it'll be into Georgia. But we need to look at where this storm's going to go afterwards, and if we can kind of visualize the storm coming up through southern, southeastern Louisiana, then hanging a little bit of a western turn, and you can see this front right here is going to meet with this and kind of push it out. This storm will stay together through the center of the country and even into Canada over the Great Lakes and then out into the Atlantic Ocean as a single system. As we can see here, it kind of comes up through the center of the country following the Mississippi. So the Mississippi River is going to take a hit because of this storm. We're going to have flooding in at least the southern states along the Mississippi River. And depending on how long this storm wants to go, we could see a pretty decent size system to the south of the center of this storm, which will be produced in about 2 or 3 days. It says June 9th here. But as we follow this system up, we can see how it kind of expands as it gets to cooler air that gets dipped down into Canada and then over the Great Lakes. This is going to be pretty significant. We're going to keep an eye on this through the 11th. And as we move towards the east again, you can kind of see how it goes right over the northeast states, New York kind of getting clipped there in the process. We could back it up a little bit here and again just watch the progress of this storm and what it does when they do get on land. So just a little lesson for the future: when hurricanes or tropical storms do make landfall, they turn into something totally different when they interact with land and other pressures in the United States specifically, which is what we're talking about now. But again, you can kind of just watch how this storm gets up into the east side of Texas, and then boom, it kind of mixes with the jet stream dip right here. You can see that cold air, the cooler air, I should say, not cold, flows back in. We still have a 986 pressure, which is lower than when we were in the Gulf itself. So the pressure actually drops, making this a stronger storm, which is more broad. It's a wider storm, so it covers more of the country. It's obviously not packing hurricane or tropical storm force winds, although straight line winds are very possible with that. We see that all the time. And again, you can just see the storm widening pretty significantly, actually. I'm actually looking at this the first time with you guys now. And then once it's over the Great Lakes, hopefully this thing stays up and over the U.S. Not great news for Canada, at least some parts of Canada. Finally, we're going to take a wide view here on Tropical Tidbits and look at what we have coming next. Now, if you guys have watched a lot of my previous videos over the years, most of these storms that we get as far as hurricanes follow this midline belt, this warm water belt, I like to call it. It's basically the equator over South America, right into the Caribbean and into the Gulf of the U.S. These storms form in Western Africa, and they come down into the Cape Verde Islands, which are right here, and then we see them start to form right in this area. Now, I'm not saying we're going to see that right now, but that is a very common tale with hurricanes. And also, because the Gulf is specifically warm this time of year, this early in the year. I know June, a lot of people think is summertime, but the Gulf is another story. The Gulf warms up slower than a lot of the other parts of the Caribbean. So when the Gulf is warm, that means it can produce and keep these storms alive. And a lot of these storms are forming in this area in between the gap between Cuba and Cancun, Mexico. This gap right here, a lot of these storms form right in this area. They could form down here. But once they form, they get the momentum to move up into the Gulf of Mexico, and as long as that water's warm, it's going to keep those storms alive and keep them strong. Some of our biggest storms we've ever seen have gone through the Gulf, including Hurricane Harvey. Now, before I let you guys go, we're going to run through this timeline we have here, which changes on a daily basis, but it's still good to at least know what we're dealing with here. We could see a Cristobal right down here, so this is current time right now, but as we move forward, we could see these little puffs of storms that come off the west coast of Africa. They are all potential storms or potential hurricanes. Just because we're not seeing them form on this chart does not mean that it's not possible. Anytime you see a low pressure form, that is an official low pressure system. Now, try to zoom down a little bit. That's good. And as we move forward, you could see. Okay, sorry about that. I had to let this load a little bit. So again, we have Cristobal right here, and you're going to see these storms come in patches or like little waves across the warm water belt right into the Leeward Islands, and then we're talking about the Caribbean and the Gulf. So as we see Cristobal make its way through the middle of the United States, we try to watch other areas. We already have a low pressure system forming here. every group of these green blobs you see are different storms, guys. So any one of these has the potential to become a bigger storm depending on what happens around it. Now, we know hurricanes are controlled by their environment around them. So we have a high pressure system in the Bermuda. The Bermuda Atlantic actually is what it's called. So the high pressure system bubble in the Atlantic Ocean, everything tends to flow around it. Basically in a counterclockwise motion. We've seen storms come down and actually get sucked back into this high pressure bubble and then pushed back into the warm water belt. But you can kind of see a pattern here how these storms follow this counterclockwise motion around the Atlantic Ocean, and which is why we see storms come up the East Coast a lot or get pushed into the Gulf depending on what pressures are coming from the jet stream in the United States. So as we move forward, we can kind of see these low pressures popping up and going away. Any of those have the potential to become a storm. And in fact, this takes us all the way to June 22nd. And by the 22nd, you can kind of see a low pressure system that resembles Cristobal in the Gulf. Now, that does not mean that that's exactly what's going to happen. It means it's a possibility. But to see it form that late and then come into the Gulf the way it does, it shows us that the Gulf is very warm and prepared for storms. Now, these storms do not have to come from the west coast of Africa. They can form right down in this area in any part of the Caribbean here or Nicaragua, any of these areas here. A lot of these storms form. In fact, Cristobal formed inland in this area right here, which is pretty rare for a storm to form inland, but the right conditions can produce those types of storms. And as we move forward, you can see these low pressures popping up and down. Any one of them can become hurricanes, guys. And I'm aware I've given you a lot of information at once, but what can I say? I'm excited to be back. We're going to be reporting on this throughout the day, and as it makes landfall, we're going to check out the conditions and see how everyone's doing. We do have a 20% chance of another disturbance forming in the Atlantic Ocean. Chances are it will not be anything because of the jet stream, which is going to actually bring Cristobal out over into the Atlantic in an eastward direction, which is going to pull this right with it. So I don't see any issue with this as of right now, but they still mark it on the chart. Very happy to be back, guys. Thank you all for staying tuned and for all the support while I was gone. We will get into that at a later date, but I pray everyone is safe and be careful out there, guys. I will talk to you all very soon. Bye-bye.